The topic of this forum, the struggle for democracy, is very timely. Our speaker is an author of many books, and he has taught in many universities. His books, to name a few, and also that you may buy at this table, and I urge you to go and buy, are Democracy for a Few, The Sword and the Dollar, Inventing Reality, and various books on media and entertainment. Michael Parenti is considered one of the nation's leading progressive speakers. Please help me to welcome Michael Parenti.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. The topic of my talk is the struggle for democracy. And the basic premise is that democracy is not a system of governance that's been handed down to us like a Grecian urn from ancient times, or something handed down to us by that gaggle of bankers and merchants and slaveholders known as our founding fathers. That the democracy is an unpredictable thing. It's a system of struggle. It's a system of governance, I should say. Democracy is a system of governance that emerges from class struggle. That's where democracy comes from. It comes from class struggle. I don't mean to say that democracy in its totality is only class struggle. There are a lot of other popular struggles that are a part of democracy, even if they're not concerned specifically with the question of surplus value and the means of production and the expropriation of labor and the oppression of one class or another. Things like the struggle for environment, the things like the struggle for women's rights, and the struggles against racism and against militarism and the like. By the way, all of which have a class dimension and class interest in them too. But it starts historically as a struggle of one class against the other, a struggle of the demos, the people, a Greek word, the demos fighting against the forces of privilege. Democracy is a wonderful invention of the people of history to defend themselves from the power of wealth and aristocracy. The earliest democracies were probably those that existed under primitive communism. In the hunting and food gathering and early horticulture societies, there was, why don't you get these two kids together? There was and they would keep each other happy. In the early horticulture societies, you had a kind of rough democracy. That is, the chief could not press his advantages, given the democracy of arms. If he did, he had to face 15, 20 other warriors who were younger and probably stronger than he. He ruled mostly by experience and resource and whatever else, and so he had to watch himself. In many of the early tribes, not all, but in many of them, there were actually systems of democratic council that existed. In the Iroquois Confederacy, the Indian nations of the Iroquois, there were councils which carried out a lot of deliberation and a lot of collective and democratic decision-making. In fact, the councils, generally the women played a dominant and more articulate role in the councils than the male warriors, and even exercised greater decision-making power. And it was a happy society, a very happy society. The equality of material conditions, that is, the equality of class conditions, made for a rough equality of political power. Now, when you get to class society, the first known democracy of any kind, in advanced horticulture society, where there's a surplus, where there's exploitation and such, And by that's what I mean by a class society, a society where the surplus that's produced by human labor is monopolized disproportionately by the propertied and the rich classes. The first known democracy in the Western world was formed in 510 BC on the Greek peninsula of Attica in a city called Athens. After extended civil strife and after the common people rose up and drove out the Spartan army that had come in to pick up on some things, the Athenian nobility came back in to restructure the old system, and the Athenian people resisted and turned to an aristocratic leader who was also a champion of the commoners, a man by the name of Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes and his faction, with this popular backing, expelled the tyranny and initiated a number of democratic reforms, including direct election of magistrates and of the legislators to a council of 500. Everyone, that is every free male, could participate except the very poorest and the propertyless. It was a hoplite democracy, it's called. The hoplite class was the third class in Athens, of the third from the bottom, made up of mostly of small farmers, but who were prosperous enough to be able to buy their own armor and serve in the army. And the hoplites decided if we're good enough to serve in the army, we're good enough to decide where the tax money goes and what wars the army fights. For all its limitations, it was the first known democracy of any kind. And this new regime was an extraordinary thing in the history of humanity in the modern era, in the ancient classical era. I mean, since the prehistoric era is what I'm talking about. It really had the fierce and devoted support of the people. And it quickly demonstrated the power that was unleashed by this new form called democracy. Even Herodotus commented on it. Right at that time, not long after, Athens was attacked by a number of other city-states in Attica who were trying to take advantage of the social strife that was going on, and they got whipped really bad. And then the real test came in 490 BC, when a massive army from the east came, the Persian army, an army of despotism, came to conquer all of the Attica Peninsula and turn Athens into a province of Persia, led by Darius the Great. I've read about Darius the Great, and I could never figure out what was great about Darius the Great. I can never figure out, this is true of all my reading of history, I can't figure out what's great about Alexander the Great, Catherine the Great. I mean, I would call them Darius the Scum, Alexander the Vile, Catherine the Yuck. So that democratic army of Athenians, 9,000, with 1,000 allies from other city-states, only 1,000. The Spartans never got there in time. They agreed to fight with the Athenians because all of Greece was at stake. The Spartans, by the time they got there, was the end of the battle. And this army, against an army that was probably twice its size, fought and beat them at the great battle of Marathon. And Herodotus writes this. He says, "There are proofs everywhere that equality before the law is an excellent thing. As long as the Athenians were ruled by tyrants, they were no better warriors than their neighbors. But once they got rid of the tyranny, they became the best of all by a long shot." This is a rather colloquial translation. I can't imagine Herodotus saying by a long shot. These dudes, no. This shows that while they were oppressed, they were willing cowards, like slaves working for a master. But when they became free, each man was eager to achieve honor for himself. And I would say also to protect what he had, and each felt he had a stake in the fight he was waging. In 461 BC, another revolutionary change comes along. With the hoplite army away, a group of propertyless insurgents, the most common of the common people, rise up armed themselves, cast aside the re-emerging aristocratic power, because there was some still aristocratic councils exercising power, and they passed a series of remarkable laws transferring almost all power to the popular assemblies and extending sovereignty to every male, including the propertyless, the most poor, the most desolate. One of the young lieutenants in that insurgency was an aristocrat with very strong democratic sympathies. He was Cleisthenes' grandson, and he emerged as the greatest leader that Athens ever produced. His name was Pericles. And Athenian democracy was, of course, morally flawed. There were periods of imperialism in its international affairs. There was the fact that women could not vote. There was the fact that there was slavery. And this has been pointed out by modern writers, and I think it's important and appropriate to point it out to remind us of the limitations of the so-called Golden Age. But the Athenians had something unique and hopeful, and we owe them something for it. The conditions of commoners improved. Class tyranny was greatly blunted, not abolished, because the rich and the aristocratic class still were there. The direct and full participation of citizens in debates, elections by lot in some of the ruling councils by lot. That is selection, not election, but selection by lot, under the premise that any human being, any citizen, any male citizen here could be qualified and had a right to have his day in the assembly to vote. Electors were picked, who in turn picked the treasurers, who supervised the publicly owned mines and other public properties. Citizens participated in massive popular assemblies that judged issues of budget, war and peace, and numerous other policies. The old aristocratic councils were divested of just about all their power except to preside over cases of homicide. And then for their part, the Athenians, might be astonished at our claim to democracy. They would look at our unelected vast bureaucracies and agencies and public authorities, our unelected judiciaries appointed for life. Nobody in Athens was appointed for more than a year. There were no term limitations, though. They were smart enough to know that term limitation is not something you want. People could be reappointed again and again. Lifelong judiciaries with judges who decided what will or will not be considered evidence in a case. The Athenians would have never tolerated that. They wanted to hear the whole story. They'd sit there and say, let it all hang out. We'll decide what's evidence and what isn't. Terms for elective office that went on more than a year, as I say. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent to buy office. By the way, that wasn't completely unknown in Athens. There was a little bit of that, but not to the extent that we witness it today. How money becomes the power determining the mobilization of numbers. Hundreds of millions, the manipulation of public information and images by large profit-making news organizations sustained by corporate advertisers. A secret state apparatus like the CIA and other national security units that refuse to release documents to the legislature, that have voted secret budgets that even most of Congress doesn't even know about. It's hidden in other items. That operates as a secret national security state to defend ruling class interests within the government, a military-industrial complex, executive veto of legislative acts. The Athenians would have never, they would have called that tyranny. Unelected military commanders, high-paid lobbyists, a Federal Reserve with public authority run by and for private bankers, dual legislatures with staggered terms and checks and balances, and a number of other odd and strange arrangements, they would have said. They would have said, how strange. You've got a long struggle ahead of you to achieve what we got in 461 BC. Through the ages, elite theorists from Socrates and Plato down to James Madison, right down to right-wing theorists today, have characterized democracy as dangerous foolishness, allowing the lowly and deficient a say in government. By the way, they're talking about you when they say the low. They're talking about us when they say the lowly, common people. When we hear that, we always think it's some people out there. They mean all of us. Socratic obsession. You read Plato. All through Plato, All through, Socrates is saying, the cobbler should do what the cobbler can do, the carpenter must do what the carpenter can do, and the statesman must do what the statesman can do. They hated democracy. And they hated it because of its class nature, because the demos, the common people, were up there sitting in the assembly. They admired Sparta, not uncritically, but it was Sparta they admired. Because those same cobblers and carpenters in Sparta were helots. They were slaves in Sparta, as it should be. That the people who worked with their hands, the idea that the people who worked with their hands should make a claim to community, to be part of the citizenship, was outrageous. And that was true, by the way, that came back even in the 16th century. The idea that the poor were part of the polity was something you don't find in the writings of the theorists of that day. They called it the commonwealth. And the poor, having no wealth or property, didn't even count, and they shouldn't be allowed to count. This was anathema to people like Plato. Not only anathema, but it was an obsession. If you read all his philosophy, all that writing, one way or another, he's getting back to this same question of equality and democracy and the hatred. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates represented an increasingly class-conscious, aristocratic class who by the mid-4th century were really at the edge of things with democracy. According to the elite theorists, the wrongful thing about democracy is its assumption that ordinary people are as good as the extraordinary people, the latter drawn from the elite class, the latter that could walk around and ask questions like, what is air? Bill Cosby, remember he said in his philosophy, he learned the question, what is air? What is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of that? Right-wing literature today is filled with elaborate, convoluted, intense defenses of social inequality. Very elaborate kinds of things about how inequality ultimately is the fairer, more just social arrangement and beneficial to all. That remains the burning imperative of conservative theory and conservative thought in America today. The Straussians, all of them. The stuff turned out by the Georgetown Political Science Department, most of them, and the rest. The real issue is not elitist supremacy or snobbery. It is who expropriates the surplus value, who gets to live well and lavishly, and who lives poorly, who gets rich owning the mine, and who has to get to go down into the mine and work it, and then with nothing to show after a lifetime. The awful thing about democracy, in Plato's words, quote, it is the power of, quote, the mass of people who work with their own hands. The mass of people who work with their own hands, take little interest in politics, and possess very little property. They come to the assembly, I'm now talking, but it's Plato's concern, that they will come to the assembly to get their share of plunder. Quote, their leaders deprive the rich of their property. Give some to the masses, keeping most of it for themselves. These leaders promise, quote, cancellation of debts and redistributions of lands. And they, unquote, and they soon become tyrants, Plato says, they soon become tyrants, and democracy, which is fitful and turbulence, is soon ended. And that image, by the way, the leader of the poor, leaders of the poor rising up, they are demagogues, by the way. If ever I get around to writing a book called Real History, I'm going to have a chapter called The Myth of the Demagogue. There's any leader through history who ever started to use the coercive power of the state, not to oppress a class, but to end the oppression of that class, was called a demagogue. When I was at Yale during the peace movement, I remember some of these rich little yellies. I was there as a postdoctoral guy and get up and I would speak against the war and all that, and they would come up to me and say, why, Mr. Parenti, why are you such a demagogue, rousing the rabble? I said, well, snot-nosed, I don't think those people are rabble. I'm not a rabble rouser. Are you rabble? Are you roused? For the class elites, democracy is an abomination, not because the common people will exercise power, but because of what they might do with that power, specifically expropriate a larger portion of the surplus value of the wealth that they create for themselves and infringe upon the interests of the aristocracy. Over 2,000 years later, James Madison made the same point as they were talking about what kind of republic could they put together. They needed a strong central government to defend their property against the leveling impulses. They had to get this thing ratified. They had a problem of having fought a revolution. There was popular sentiment out there, and they couldn't quite put all that back in the bottle. And Madison made a brilliant statement in a great paper he wrote, the greatest paper I have ever read by a bourgeois theorist, the Federalist Paper number 10, where he says, the trick is how do we keep the Republican forms without the ill effects of republicanism and the excesses of democracy? Brilliant. I mean, he knew a very short paper, and he laid it all out there very clearly. And he said, democracies, not in Federalist 10, he said it elsewhere. He said it at the Constitutional Convention. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property. Now you're really getting to what's on his mind. And have been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. By the way, Plato would have subscribed to that image of democracy. And by the way, it's absolutely false. The Athenian democracy of 461 BC lasted for 140 years of stability and relatively fair organization, with only two broken, turbulent times, and that was when the aristocrats came back to power, the period of the 30 tyrants, coming in on the swords of the Spartan invading army. Just like the bourgeoisie of the Paris Commune saving themselves by getting the Prussian army to back up the peasant army they rallied around to crush the workers' rebellion in the Paris Commune of 1871. Exact same pattern, that when push comes to shove, their nationalism goes out the window. They'll make deals with the Nazis, they'll make deals with the Spartans, they'll make deals with the Prussians, anybody, if they can get their comprador class status back, and if they can put the great unwashed back in their place. From 1787 to 1800, the U.S. government was controlled by a group called the Federalist Party, composed, by the way, mostly of rich people. One historian notes, quote, surely the frankest politicians who ever graced the American scene, the Federalists made no pretense of being other than what they were, upper-class Americans who had a natural-born right to rule their inferiors in the social and economic scale. Not quite true. Having just read this, in fact, it's from a page of a thing I'm working on now, and I didn't comment it now, but just as I'm talking now, it's not quite true that they were all that frank and candid about that point. They were to each other. And what we have is the record of their letters and their notes and their conferences and whatever else. They never said those things to the people out there, not usually. Federalist leader Alexander Hamilton, when talking to his other friends at the Constitutional Convention, said that the rich and the well-born should rule. They were the only ones fit to rule for the benefit of all. He denounced the, quote, pernicious innovation and amazing violence and turbulence of the democratic spirit. Another Federalist justice, Samuel Chase, much hated, by the way, by the people, saw the common people as, quote, governed by their passions and not by reason. Were they to have popular suffrage, the country would, quote, sink into a mobocracy. Again, as I say, the only thing wrong with that whole image is that it's not supported by the data of history. That isn't what the democracies were far no more unstable and a lot more stable than any number of the monarchies and whatever else. Political theorists throughout his history have hated the common people. That's us. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Hobbes, Locke. You can go on. You can read, you study classical political theory. I studied classical political theory at Yale University when I was getting my PhD under Professor Frederick Watkins. And it was always called classical theory, or it was always called political theory. It was never called class theory. But it took me years later to realize that all of these people writing were always writing from up here. Who else sits around, has the time and the leisure and the resources to write these great tomes to tell us what the world is all about and how we should feel about the world? You go through all of history, and you could count on one hand the number of theorists who were actually Democrats. James Harrington in the 17th century, John Lilburne, and a little bit of Rousseau. And I've still got 2 fingers left over. Jefferson, maybe. Depends. I can't get a political theory out of Jefferson, actually. So, of the anti-democratic myths that have been propagated over the centuries, one of the most common is the myth of natural superiority and mutual utility. Every economic elite, having its own interests at heart, seeks to protect its wealth and the good living that it enjoys. The Holy Bible, quote, "For where your treasure is, there will be your heart also." Matthew 6:21. And where your treasure is, there too will be your class ideology. Parenti 101. Throughout history, class elites, by the way, have sought to legitimate their rule by claiming assignment from God, divine rights, sovereignty comes from God, or providence, it was so meant to be, or by natural superiority. I've already noted the aristocratic class argued this in Greece. People of high station exhibited by that very fact, Aristotle said, by the very fact that they are in high station, this must exhibit high qualities. By the very fact that others are in low station, this must exhibit deficient qualities. And that all would live together and could the interests of all, the relations of governed and governor, slave and master, are best served in the manner that nature intended by a system of mutual utility, if everybody accepts their own place. Now, needless to say, this was a sentiment that was held more firmly by the slaveholders than by the slaves, and more firmly by the aristocrats than by the poor. Feudalism was described glowingly and nostalgically by a 16th century scribe as, quote, "Such a knot of collateral amity between the lords and the tenants, that the lord tendered his tenant as his own child. And the tenants again loved and obeyed the Lord as naturally as the child the father." This romanticized representation of serfdom would have surprised no one more than the serfs themselves, living as they did under crushing taxes and rents and the corvée and compulsory labor, which they often had to do just when the necessary crops and stuff they had to do for themselves. They'd have to go off and serve the Lord in some way. The very essence of feudal property, R.H. Tawney concluded, was exploitation in its most naked and shameless form. In pre-revolutionary landlord China, the rich gentry responded confidently to anyone who advocated social change by saying, quote, "Can the sun rise in the west?" In other words, the Chinese peasants condemned to a life of serfdom, if they questioned the existing social relations, they could no more hope to change those social relations than they could expect the sun to rise in the west. This was the natural order of things. In this modern democratic age, there are plenty of theorists who argue that public affairs should be left in the hands of knowledgeable elites who supposedly know things that we do not know. I won't even go into all of them. In fact, I picked 2 political figures as examples. Political leaders often offer all sorts of rationales to encourage an uncritical faith in themselves. Vice President Spiro Agnew, one of the great theorists of the Republican Party, and I mean that seriously, one of the leading theorists, about the best they've produced. He said, just as patients must rely on their physician's expertise for medical care, so ordinary citizens must depend on their leaders, the experts in statescraft. Ordinary laypersons could no more expect to make decisions about policy than about medical treatment. By the way, not long after this utterance, this expert statescraftsman, Agnew, was indicted for illegally using the influence of his office to perform special favors for special friends, and was kicked out of the vice presidency, as you remember. He used to do these special favors. In return, these friends, very appreciative of his expertise in statescraft, would bring him large paper bags right to the vice president's residence, Blair House. It was back when the vice president still lived in Blair House, right across the street from Lafayette Park. They bring him large paper bags full of cash. No wonder Agnew did not want the public intruding too much upon the policy process. In 1991, Polish President-elect Wałęsa, another heavyweight, having used democracy to overthrow the communist state, demanded that the democratically elected parliament suspend its powers and make way for rule by presidential edict. And they've had that problem, they still have that problem. Yeltsin is making the same demand today, which is to get rid of the legislatures. The Moscow economists, who are more right-wing than National Review. I'm not kidding. They are so far right. They get critical. They criticize William Buckley, Robert Conquest, people like that, for being too soft on communism. These guys are now saying democracy has served its purposes. Now we've got to get rid of it. We've got to have rule by executive ukaz. By the way, I predicted this. I did say that. I said they will use democracy to get rid of communism. They will ride in and say it's a big democracy, but once democracy becomes too troublesome, once popular power gets used to defend the standard of living of the people, they will have to get rid of that popular power and change the rules of the game once more. Because the goal is not democracy, but capitalism. To bring in those free market reforms, to cut back on benefits, to cut back on job protections, to cut back on human services and all the rest, which is what they're doing, and eliminating price controls and all the rest, all those other protections, which are democratic protections for people, economic democracy, to eliminate economic democracy and bring in a capitalism, a really kind of free market, harsh, third world capitalism is what the people of Eastern Europe are going to be getting. They thought they would go from second world status to first world status, and in fact it went the other way. Poland thought it would become another Austria or Sweden or West Germany, and instead it's becoming another Mexico or Turkey, or like with a lot of cheap labor out there, with the more prosperous public enterprises being picked up for a song for privatization by private corporations. Not the ones that aren't working, but the ones that do work and show a profit. Those are the ones that Western capital is coming in and taking over. So they're getting the worst of both worlds. Well, Lech Wałęsa said that it was necessary in order to deliver the blessings of the free market, he didn't say this, I'm saying it, upon a population that was really trying to fight off this so-called shock therapy of unemployment, inflation, loss of human services and all that, that the president would have to have the powers to really make the changes that none of the people wanted. Now, when you want to rule in a direction that none of the people want, that's not what I call democracy. And reflecting on this popular sentiment, reflecting this popular sentiment, Parliament kept resisting a lot of Wałęsa's draconian measures. The Czech Parliament did the same with Havel, and the Russian Parliament is doing the same right now with Yeltsin. And so parliamentary democracy, for Wałęsa, democracy was a troublesome barrier. In arguing for executive absolutism, he resorted to the same kind of anti-communist, he resorted to the same kind of anti-democratic metaphor, analogy, I should say, as Agnew did. It's fine. He says, Lech Wałęsa, a bus must be driven by the driver and not by the passengers, who might all try to grab the wheel at once and who would succeed only in plowing the bus into a tree. Brilliant, brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? These kind of arguments are endless throughout history, these analogies of taking a expert thing and showing why, therefore, people can't rule because you need the expert to do it, By the way, even if you want to argue the analogies, you might wonder. I don't believe in arguing analogies. When someone gives me an analogy, I say, that's something else. Let's talk about this, okay? But if you want to argue the analogy, it really doesn't even hold up. The relationship of democratic citizen, the relationship of patient to doctor. Patients should show no more unquestioning trust toward doctors than citizens toward officials. Patients should ask about the purpose of specific medical procedures. They should get second opinions. They should offer critical feedback if they find that rare doctor who will actually listen, and make the final decision on whether to submit to a particular treatment. And so with the analogy of the bus driver, The same with the bus. Certainly passengers should not try to grab the wheel, but they certainly have a right to know where they're being taken, by whom, over what course, at what speed, and with what degree of competence and safety. And if they don't like how or where the bus is being driven, they usually can vote with their feet and get off at the next stop, which is something you can't do in a polity. You see, we can't very well do that in a political society. So an analogy can only have suggestive or heuristic, illustrative value. It really can't be used with any kind of logical conclusiveness, because really comparing situations that are parallel in form, you're still looking at situations that are vastly different in content. And whatever you decide about doctor-patient relations or passenger-bus driver relations is immaterial in the final analysis. It has really little to do with settling the original question regarding the role of democratic input in the political affairs of a modern state. The notion that people must trust their leaders, have trust in their leaders. I heard there was one guy doing that all through 1990, 91. George Herbert Walker Bush, who kept saying, trust me, my leadership. He kept talking about that. I know what I'm doing, and watched him kill all those people. I mean, history is full of examples of how people who trusted their leaders have led themselves into very unfortunate fates. Examples of monarchs, dictators, prime ministers, and presidents who were not deserving of the slightest trust, who pursued policies that violated the interests of their people in every way. My reading of the history of monarchs, I read about monarchs in France, England, reading about it, and I finally sat back and I said, what is motivating all these kings? And there's one thing that's really motivating them. How can they extract more surplus value from their people? How can they tax them a little more? How can they squeeze a little more out of the land? How can they get a little more out of the townships? They go off and fight a war to grab a province. Why do they grab the province? To bring it laws? To bring it order? To uplift and save its citizens? They go and grab the province and they'll describe it. It's a rich province. They go and kill so they can get more for themselves, so they can live off the labor of others. And yet we hear that. During the Vietnam War, I heard someone remark that I was a student at the University of Vermont. She said, you know, they've been fighting this war so long, and I think our president must know some things that we don't know. And therefore, we've got to put our trust in his leadership. Otherwise, why would he be going to such extremes doing all these things? It's very discouraging. And I sit there and I say, so much left to do, so much work to do. In 1991, when I was at George Mason University in Virginia, another student, he got up and he said, well, there's a difference between you and me because I trust the president. I have faith in the president. And I said, you have faith in the president? You mean, what do? You light a candle to him the way my grandmother did for St. Anthony every night? What do you mean you have faith in the president? That's not what it's about. Such expressions of faith may be an inspiration to some, but they should discomfort any Democrat, small d. Any believer in democracy should get very uncomfortable when your fellow citizens are saying, have faith in your leaders. That's not what democracy is about. Trust your leaders. The essence of democracy is that you distrust your leaders, that you hold them accountable, you call them... Democracy is a system built on distrust, a method of accountability and governance, of deliberation, of debate, of challenge, of exposure, of explaining yourself. Being a leader is no guarantee of some special wisdom or virtue. When you think about it, being a leader is no guarantee of any particular expertise either, as Agnew's performance demonstrated. By the way, if one reads the minutes of presidential meetings or the correspondence between top decision makers, or listens to a president or cabinet member at a press conference, or reads the memoirs of erstwhile leaders, what strikes me when I do that, whether I'm sitting in the National Archives reading some of this stuff or listening to Bush at a press conference. What strikes me is how unexpert the policymakers sound, how their thinking seems free of particular enlightenment or esoteric insight or information. One is struck by the self-serving manipulation, the superficiality of their claims and statements, the fabricated justifications, the inconsistencies, the evasions, the downright lies, the makeshift jumble of contrived arguments that are conjured up to justify policies that often have no democratic justification whatever. One comes away with a better understanding of why leaders so often insist upon performing secretly without having to give an account of their actions, because they don't know more than we do. They just want us to think they do. From the 17th century to the present day, laissez-faire economists have treated people in different social classes as endowed with different human natures. Again, I want to point out, not just in political theory, but in economic theory, it comes across even more staggeringly. A hatred for the common people, a feeling that they're not worth much. Since they're not worth much in the bank, they're not worth much as human beings. If, after all, your value and your measurement is the cash nexus, then how much value could you possibly give to the poor? Different people of different social classes had different natures. Again, the theory of natural superiority. And therefore, they required dissimilar incentives, different kinds of incentives. For the rich to be enterprising, they must be fortified with subsidies, tax write-offs, and whatever else brings a high return on their investments. For the poor to exert themselves, they've got to have the dole and the other income support programs eliminated so they can be faced with deprivation. In other words, the rich will work if they're given money, the poor will work if they have money kept from them. As one 18th century English gentleman wrote, "Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious." It's wonderful to go back and read them in the 18th century, because they're much more, they really say it then. But again, not publicly, it's just the letters to each other. The ruling class today has gotten so smart that they often don't even say that sort of thing even in private sometimes, although they do. Let's look at that natural superiority of those of substance and property. The capitalist mythology claims a natural superiority for superior means, but it doesn't say how people ever arrived at those superior means. How is the family wealth originally accumulated? What's behind these old families? There's a lovely passage in Adam Smith's Wealth of the Nation where he talks about old families, and he says, what do we mean by old families? Surely the pauper and the prince both have an ancient lineage. They both go back. You go as far back as Rockefeller does too, unless you want to claim you're a fourth generation mutation or something that just came. We all come from old families. So Smith says, I know what they mean when they say old families. They mean families where the money has been there a while. It's old money. Well, if you look in the lineage of almost every old family, there can be found a plunderer, a swindler, or a freebooter whose ill-gotten gains became the family inheritance. Nelson Aldrich Jr. wrote not too long ago, he noted the dubious but not unique achievements of his own great-grandfather, Nelson Aldrich Sr. Back in 1880, the son of a mill hand who entered the U.S. Senate with very modest assets, he received an annual salary of only $5,000 a year. Yet, after 30 years in politics, he died with $12 million. And if one looks into the genealogies of many old families, one discovers episodes of slave trafficking, rum smuggling, gun running, land grabs, violent acquisitions of water and mineral rights, opium trading. The Delanos were opium traders. I only found that out the other night. I was watching this thing, a documentary on China, and I've been reading about the opium trade in China and the opium wars, and they said, Delano. Old man Delano was making millions on the opium trade. That's a New York aristocratic family. You've heard of them, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The slaughter of indigenous peoples, falsified deed claims, sales of shoddy and unsafe goods, protection rackets, public funds used for private speculations, crooked deals in government bonds and vouchers, government giveaways, and payoffs for political favors. One will find in the old families fortunes that are built on slave labor, indentured labor, prison labor, immigrant labor, women's labor, child labor, and scab labor, all backed by the lethal force of gun thugs and assassins and militia and army. Old money, my friends, old money is often little more than dirty money that's been laundered by several generations of possession. In the modern era of popular elections, political leaders have learned to deny the existence of class warfare and class differences, even as they engaged in it from the top down. During the labor agitations of the late 19th century, Senator Roscoe Conkling denounced, quote, "the most dangerous of the country's enemies, those who maintain that a conflict exists between the two great partners, capital and labor." He and other politicos sought to distract and dilute working class militancy with a whole set of what historian Matthew Jacobson called the most ingenious tactics of ideology. They played upon racial, linguistic, regional, and religious differences and old country loyalties in order to work against the groundswell of class interest. They sought thereby to divide and to neutralize sections of the working population, thereby displaying, Josephson goes on, quote, "an unusual awareness rather than indifference to underlying economic issues and class forces." It wasn't that they didn't know about classes, that they didn't want you to know about classes and differences. Class-conscious plutocrats are the first to condemn class consciousness when it emerges among the general populace. In 1935, press mogul William Randolph Hearst denounced the Wagner Act, which was designed to protect labor's rights to organize, as, quote, "one of the most vicious pieces of class legislation that could be conceived, un-American to the core." By the way, most legislation is class legislation, favoring the haves at the expense of the have-nots, especially the laws that safeguard corporate prerogatives and subsidize upper-class income and investments. It's only those rare policies that favor the many against the few, that are singled out as divisive and even unpatriotic. In 1989 presidential campaign and the 1992 campaign, George Bush both times denounced class warfare. He talked about the attempts to revoke tax laws that benefited the rich as class warfare. "There is no place in American public life," he said, "for the kind of talk that divides Americans along class lines." So here's an upper-class warrior, you see. For him, policies that shifted the tax burden onto the shoulders of the working populace were not class warfare, only policies that sought to undo such favoritism. Another upper-class warrior, Pope John Paul II, I call him the CIA Pope, that most political of all popes, denounced efforts by liberation theologians to mobilize the poor and, quote, "see the poor as a class in struggle or as separate from pastoral obedience." So the poor should not be thinking of themselves as a class. If they're not a class, what are they? The poor. What do you mean by the poor? The Pope did not define the continually successful pursuit of power and privilege by the rich as part of class warfare. Top-down class warfare is never noticed. It's only when people begin to mobilize and fight back. Democracy is not a fixed, finished system. It's not, because people debate, do we really have a democracy? Yes, we do. No, we don't. Yes, we do. It's not a fixed system. We do have some democratic elements. We have won some very real democratic victories. We're not living under fascism, although we could very easily go in that direction if it became a question of saving capitalism from its own internal crises. Remember that fascism came to Italy and to Germany not because of some threat from outside. The left was never that strong. It came from the enormous contradictions of its own system. It came from the necessity of having to impose upon the people a greater and greater degree of austerity. to take away from them the democratic gains that they had won, the substantive democratic gains they'd won. And when you do that, the people mobilize and try to defend themselves against it, so finally you have to take away their political democracy too. And democracy, that's what I'm saying, democracy is an ongoing process of self-realization, and it has two dimensions, procedural and substantive democracy. Procedural democracy are elections, free speech, voting, access to information, recall, referendum, all those things. Substantive democracy is what is the payoff? What is the output of the system? Is it democratically? And ultimately, the desirability of a system is its substantive outputs. It is not a process empty of social content. Sidney Hook says democracy is just a matter of the rules of the game. It's an open-ended game. What happens and what they do is that's some other question. Charles Krauthammer, little reactionary columnist for the Washington Post, democracy is empty of content. People can do unfortunate things with it. No, if they do unfortunate things, he said, look at the Azerbaijani, what they're doing there. And when the Azerbaijani think that freedom means the freedom to kill Armenians, they're not acting democratically. I'm sorry, that's not democracy in action. I mean, that kind of idea does indeed reduce democracy to a game, but it's not a game. I argue that democracy is a system of governance that in both its form and its content must represent the interest of the governed. Elections are not an end in themselves. That is, finally, you have to ask, does this system create policy outputs that are of benefit to us? That's why we want it. We're not ritualists. We're not just in love with elections for the sake of elections. If it doesn't produce, John Stuart Mill made that point. He's talked about the exercise of criticism and freedom is its own reward, even if the people choose less wisely than some other rulers might. That's a good point, that let the people find their own way and make their own mistakes. But this other idea that democracy is encapsulated in its instrumental function, its instrumentalism, is something that I don't accept. The exercise of freedom is more than just a personal growth experience, you know. Oh, I voted for one of two meaningless candidates, and I really feel better, you know, like, I just feel, You know about the importance of personal growth. We don't have any shortage of it out here in Marin, do we? Of personal growth. What is this doing for me as an individual? Usually accompanied with a claw-like gesture to the sternum. Me. What is it doing for me? I remember during the Seabrook sit-ins and demonstrations when so many people got arrested, and I was down at the demonstration, all that, and then later we had a rally afterwards, and some kid got up and he said, oh, wow, he said, look, hey, I don't care what happens. Everybody here is uptight about what happens if we stop Seabrook. All I know is a beautiful experience for me to get arrested and share with these other people. And my rockets almost went off. I said, we're not here to give you a beautiful experience. If you get a beautiful experience, that's good. But that's not the end, you see. The end is we want to stop destroying the planet and our lives. We want to do that. That also is. In other words, the exercise of democracy is more than an exercise. A democratic people should be able to enjoy freedom from economic oppression as well as political oppression. They should enjoy humane, material conditions. I would also argue that the class struggle has brought an expansion in procedural democracy. The struggle for class interests has, in fact, expanded our political rights. The working class fought for improved working conditions. Back in the early part of the 19th century, there were large numbers of working men who started agitating for the vote. Why? It wasn't the vote they wanted. It was they wanted to be able to feed themselves and their families. They wanted to be able to improve their working conditions. To improve their working conditions, they had to improve a number of things that were going on, the distribution of power. To change the outcome of this game, we have to get into the game. To get into the game, we've got to change the very rules that are excluding us. So they went out there and they demonstrated. And they agitated with torchlight parades, with insurgencies, with riots, with all these kinds of things. And the enfranchisement of working men in the 1820s came after an enormous amount of agitation and struggle and resistance and strikes. The struggle was not for the vote per se. The struggle was for a shorter workday, for better wages, which included the struggle for the vote and the struggle for the right to peaceably assemble. The struggle for free speech, the wobbly free speech fights of the 1910s and 1920s. There were fights for free speech. And who was fighting for it? It wasn't the intellectuals, and it wasn't the artists, and it wasn't the elites of the society. It wasn't the greats. Just some years before, 30, 40 years before, when in the Paris Commune, Georges Sand writes, the Paris Commune is nothing but a mob, a bunch of coarse clowns. A woman who was herself an iconoclast and called for the equality of women and who wore pants, which proves that wearing pants is no guarantee of wisdom and justice ever, but whose class colors, when push came to shove, came out. Worse than she was Flaubert, who what he said about the Paris working class was nothing but utter hatred. These are the artists, the creative people, the leading people, the fine people, the intellectual people, the refined people, all that stuff. And what were they doing? They weren't the ones who fought for the free speech. By the way, of course there were people of that class who were on the side of democracy all the time, but not as a discernible social formation, almost never. It was the Wobblies. And why were the Wobblies fighting for free speech? Because they wanted to organize working people in the industrial workers of the world, one big union. And how could they organize when they go into a town and the sheriff and his goons beat them up and throw them in jail? And they discovered when they went in with 2 or 3, they got terribly treated. But they went in with 200 or 300, it became a different ball game. And 2,000 or 3,000. And they would come, men and women, riding the rails, wagons, marching, walking miles, taking over towns and saying, we will fight in towns where if a union organizer or an anarchist or a socialist or a communist had ever shown his face, he would be shot through or thrown in prison. And it was that ferment down there of agitation that percolated upward. It's trickled up. Any of the humane things that happen end up by being trickled up to the Supreme Court. And that's when you got Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes making decisions like, time has upset many a fighting fate, and we should be able to understand that these people have the right for this and that and the other thing, and the dissenter is sacrosanct and all that. So the struggle for material conditions led to the expansion of procedural rights. And procedural rights are a reflection of the material conditions of class power. We have freedom of speech, for instance, ourselves. We do. We fought for it. There's a time when a meeting like this would have been, even in a community like this, would have been padlocked, and the sheriff would have come along and taken a radical, Marxist, troublemaking, rabble-rouser type like Michael Parenti and thrown him and anyone else who came to the meeting in jail. I mean, that's not unknown in our history. That's right in this century that was happening. It happened to people like John Reed. It happened to people like Big Bill Haywood. It happened to Mother Jones. They'd get arrested and thrown in jail for the crime of thinking, speaking. It's only after fighting and agitating that we've won that right. That is, we reached that point. But we don't have freedom of speech in the corporate media. We can reach audiences of hundreds, maybe sometimes even thousands, but we can't reach the millions of the mass media because our freedom, the popular agitation that we have, has not penetrated that immense corporate power that's up there. Our power has not penetrated those domains. So those domains are left to the George Wills and the William Buckleys and the John McLaughlins and a few tepid, skittish liberals who are always dressing up their right to show that they're reasonable. The establishment pundits. People of my persuasion are not on the major media on any regular basis. Once in a while you get on. And you got one right-winger here, another one here screaming at you, making sure you can't finish a sentence. So freedom and power are often seen as antithetical. Power is something that threatens freedom, when in fact they may be more symbiotic. If you don't have the power, you don't have the freedom. To the extent that we have power to make them take us into account, only to that extent do they take us into account. That's why this election that's coming up is not just a charade. It's something more than that. There is substance in there. If it's such a charade, do you think George Bush and his class would not want to abolish elections? Imagine if there was no election. What would he be doing now? What would he be doing to you? We would be getting it up one side and down the other. He'd be bombing Cuba, which he might do anyway if reelected. He'd be lame duck. He said it. He said he would at the Republican National Convention. He said, if I'm reelected, I will take action against Cuba. I said, what action is left? He's done everything else. Boycotts, blockades, third country isolations now. What is left? The only thing that's left is direct action. And they've learned from Iraq that you don't have to lose American troops. The only things that kept the United States from finally destroying and attacking Cuba was, one, they were worried about what the reaction of the Soviet Union would be. That's gone. And two, they were worried about what public American reaction was, and now they think they know how to handle that. You demonize the leader. They've already been doing that. Fidel Castro is a big drug dealer now. Well, I mean, what a joke. He's the only person in that whole region, Central America, the only head of state who probably isn't dealing in drugs. And he's got a nuclear plant that might have weapons in it and all that sort of thing. And they start sending out and feeding those stories. They were doing that, brothers and sisters, just last year, about 6 months after the Iraq War. He was already floating those stories out, and the only thing that stopped him was the polls which showed that he was in such trouble about domestic issues and that he might look too adventuristic if he keeps doing these kind of things, and that this one might backfire and not give him popularity. That was the only thing that stopped George Bush from going on and building up the demonizing hype, as he did with Noriega, as he did with Saddam Hussein, and as of course he could do even more easily with Fidel Castro, because that image has been softened up for 40 years or more. And they don't have to use American troops in Cuba. They've learned in the Iraq War that they could destroy a society by systematically surgical bombing, and that bombing was surgical, even if 90% of the bombs were free falling. They surgically, systematically destroyed the life support systems of that society, its water systems and electrical systems, and plunged it back, destroyed its material base, and plunged it back into a desperate situation, into a terrible third world client, fourth world Haiti kind of level of existence. And this is what could happen with Cuba if he's elected. So it's really not true that it doesn't matter who is elected. It does matter, and it matters a great deal as measured in the lives of any number of people. If that ruling class that he represents didn't have to face elections, you would be working now for 60 cents an hour, maybe 60 cents a day. You'd be working at subsistence. This environment would be even worse than it is today. It would be more like it is in the third world, where the environment is an absolute shock, where the environmental controls are almost non-existent. And you could go on. I don't want to, as I said, there were other popular struggles besides class struggle in the democratic struggle. And one of those has been the struggle for racial equality. And again, if you read the old civil rights leaders, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, William White, these others, who are often now scorned as being, just kind of really conservative guys. They're just worried about desegregation. Well, that was the big issue they were facing in the South. But go back and read their columns. They also talked about jobs, schools. They talked about substantive democratic issues, that this portion of the people deserve something more. And so the struggle for the vote was a struggle not for some abstract thing called equality, and not even only to eliminate Jim Crow, which was an offense and an insult and indignity. But there was a struggle for some very real things like better jobs, better education, and better life chances. The struggle for women's equality is another example. The fight for the suffrage was not just the right to the vote. Women did not agitate for a century for the vote just for the hell of it, out of some superficial thing like some gender ego thing. Well, you men have the vote, so we should have the vote. There were very real material problems that women faced and still do. Women's labor exploitation, women working in plants 14 hours a day, young women, no property rights in many cases, often chattels to their husbands, no protection from abuse, no access to medical school. They couldn't go to medical school, couldn't go to law school, couldn't go to professional or graduate schools, and numerous other kinds of restrictions. So in the pursuit of a procedural democracy and extending procedural democracy, the franchise, there was substantive interest behind it. And by the way, there are substantive payoffs too. And by the way, they were never given the vote. Women were never given. When I hear women were given the vote, I say, who gave them the vote? What do you mean they were given the vote? They had to fight, just as African Americans have had to fight, and people of color had to fight, and everybody. They've had to agitate and struggle and organize for the better part of a century and suffer all sorts of calumny and mistreatment. Now, from this, it might be mistakenly concluded that procedural democracy is just the icing on the cake, and the really important thing is substantive democracy. I'm not saying that. There's a vital interplay. When certain populations win certain procedural rights, this has a real payoff. The Civil Rights Voting Act of 1965 had a substantive payoff in the quality of life of African Americans in the South. I mean, if you can go to Richmond, Virginia, and walk in and see the guy who's taking care of the deeds claims, office director and all, is an African American in a building, in a state building where that man 40 years ago could have never set foot in that building through the front entrance, could never have ridden in the elevator, and it could have spent a durable amount of time in that building only if he had a broom in his hand to see that. That's not an inconsiderate democratic, that's a democratic victory. That's a victory for all of us. That's a victory against privilege, against bigotry, against sexism, against racism. The Wagner Act that William Randolph Hearst was cursing but a few minutes ago, I quoted him. That Wagner Act, which Roosevelt just threw out as a sop, the Magna Carta of labor, said, well, throw something to the unions. He had no idea what was going to happen. Millions of people suddenly grabbed the ball and ran with it and said, FDR and the White House and the federal government's behind it. We can organize unions now. And industrial unions were formed all over the country. Millions of people. Phenomenal thing that happened in the 1930s. With strikes and wage improvements and all, which, by the way, led to a reallocation of the surplus value amounting to millions of dollars that would have gone to the bosses and the owners and the stockholders and the capitalist class through the improvement of wage structures and other benefits went to working people. And that's what they don't like when it cuts into that surplus value. For all their insufficiencies, the gains in economic democracy have been very real, and they are much hated by the reactionary owning class. The 8-hour day, disability insurance, Social Security, pensions, occupational safety, environmental protections, racial and gender equality. As I say, all those things also have a class interest. I mean, if I'm an owner, I don't want anybody having equality. People of color, women, they do some of the dirtiest, most mindless, underpaying work. I don't want them raising their expectations, making more claims. The more they expect, the more I'm going to have to give them. The more I have to give them, the less there is for me. I mean, it really gets down to that. George Bush and his boys know what it is. What's the one issue he has been fighting for with a passion? The one domestic issue. A cut in the capital gains tax, right? That's the one issue. He's really kind of naked about it. You know, and he lies, of course. He said, that's for everybody. That'll help everybody. But they know what they want. It's this fight for the surplus value. Again, I don't want to reduce racism and sexism as just being purely class issues. There are also dynamics that happen in racism that develop a dynamic of their own and have to be dealt with and confronted in that way. There are also things in sexism. In fact, I think we ought to stop using the word sexism use it less and use some. We need a stronger word, male terrorism, maybe, if you want. Sexism conjures up. See, only the women are applauding. I mean, sexism conjures up uncomfortable harassment in the office. And what women have to face, I don't want to make light of that, that's a real issue. Women have had to face beatings, rape. They're still fighting for that most basic right of all. More basic than the right to vote or speech or fair wage or whatever else is the right to personal security. Just the other... No, I'm stopping. And that's a whole issue which goes beyond the class issue, which is not unrelated, as I tried to show just in passing. The abortion issue is another case. By the way, when I listed all these rights, one thing I want to add about these rights is that they are never completely secure. That just when you thought you've won a right, you may see it disappear. We may, in our own lifetime, see the 8-hour day disappear. We may see child labor come back in certain disguised forms. Don't think that's impossible. The Chileans thought that was impossible until Pinochet got in. The Italians thought that was impossible until Mussolini got in. As the people mobilize, as I said before, to try to save what's theirs and defend their standard of living, the battle against their standard of living also becomes a war against the democratic rights that enable them to defend whatever little they can. I mean, whatever little rights we've got. I also want to point out that democracy doesn't grow up as a product of capitalism, but in reaction to it. The association of democracy with free market capitalism overlooks the many capitalist nations such as Turkey, Zaire, Indonesia, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, that don't extend democratic rights to their citizens. Even among the capitalist nations that do observe democratic forms, as I've said through my whole lecture, there is often a sad lack of democratic content. Democratic gains have usually been won against the opposition of the wealthy and the powerful, and not with their encouragement. It would be inaccurate to credit the rich landowners, merchants, industrialists, and financiers with the genius of democracy, their system of capitalism with the genius of democracy, when in fact they have opposed almost every egalitarian democratic reform, be it universal suffrage, free speech, civil liberties, women's rights, civil rights, collective bargaining, social security, occupational safety, a safe and clean environment. You can go on. Rather than buttressing democracy, free market capitalism poses, with its immense concentrations of wealth and power, it poses a serious obstacle and threat to popular rule. An acquaintance of mine shamefacedly said, when he was retiring and getting his pension, he said, I don't like capitalism, but I'll take its pension. So, I said, what do you mean, its pension? The bosses didn't give you that pension. That's not a product of capitalism. It happens to be a right that was extracted, took it from their teeth. You had to win that right for free speech, for pension, for anything you can mention. As the great American socialist Eugene Victor Debs said, to the extent that we can ever make this system have any measure of humanity, it's only because of our own struggle against it. The people must always be mobilized in a countervailing force, or peoples, or groups, or publics, and it's hard to get a unified mass all at once, it's true. John Stuart Mill, 1869. This time I agree with him. The concessions of the privileged to the underprivileged are so seldom brought about by any other motive than the power of the underprivileged to extort them. 1857, the great African-American leader Frederick Douglass wrote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." So rather than saying you can't fight the powers that be, we might better say that we cannot afford not to. It's often frustrating. It's even sometimes dangerous. It's often dangerous even and frustrating to challenge those who own and control the land, the labor, the capital, and the technology and the communications of the society. But in the long run, it's even more dangerous not to do so. As history shows, sooner or later, people will endeavor to resist the disadvantages imposed upon them by unjust and painful socioeconomic conditions. They fight back for several reasons, propelled by a vision for a better life for all, or moved by the imperatives of a particular issue, or mobilized by the necessities of their own material conditions. Whatever it is, inequities and iniquities can become so oppressive that quiet submission and accommodation no longer guarantees survival, and then the people have nothing to lose in resisting. This is not to say they will always rebel against oppression, but the right combination of anger, understanding, hope, and organization sometimes can galvanize them to perform remarkable deeds throughout history. The worst thing that people can do is nothing. Passivity and compliance are the goal of all rulers who seek to gain their own class ends. Jesse Jackson says, "Keep hope alive." I like Jesse, but I don't like that slogan. It's kind of victim talk. It's a minimalist position. We've got to keep more than hope alive. We've got to keep our determination, and we've got to keep our anger alive, and we've got to direct that anger and our indignation and our demands, direct them against our enemies, those who impose their interests and power on us at our expense, at the expense of our environment, at the possible survival of our planet. So what we need is not less democracy, but more and more of it. Thank you.